Closed captioning is provided as a public service by the state of South Carolina.
Come ride with us for a literary tour of South Carolina.
Oops.
What I care about is that what I'm writing allows you to understand what really happened, how it happened, why it happened, and the impact of its happening. Well, for courses I teach, and it may be a history course even, the first assignment is to read the book Elements of Style and then write a 2 to 3 page response for me. And I've had students who are seniors in college who said, why didn't somebody give me this book earlier? But they're very grateful to have had that experience, and usually their writing helps them in other courses. It improves. Well, you're writing for a different audience, and every time you write, you're writing for an audience. So if you're writing for the Nation or the New Republic, you're writing for a national audience. If you're writing for the state newspaper in Columbia or the Post and Courier in Charleston, then you're writing for a local audience. And so you always have to write for the reader. If you're writing as a lawyer, a brief, the audience is usually 1 judge or 3 judges. So you write for a specific audience. Newspaper reporting is one of the most fun jobs in the world. You get a front row seat to history as it's being made. And you also learn to write on deadlines because you're writing on deadline all the time. And that's useful, I think, in any kind of writing, that kind of experience. So you don't get much in the way of writer's block because you sit down and simply start writing when you're ready. The lead sentence is a thing that's called the hook that gets the reader into the story. But it can go in 2 directions. It can be a direct lead. If it's a story that's called a breaking story, something that's just happening, you're covering city council. What was the most important thing that was done, or who made a really great colorful quote? And it's usually good to save that colorful quote for the second paragraph that reinforces the first paragraph on what really happens. You know, city council decides they're going to have a new ordinance that requires no smoking in bars, no smoking in restaurants. And one councilman says, good Lord, he said, all smokers are going to vote against me next time. But it's the right thing to do. That might be the good kind of quote to have in the second paragraph. The lead is that they're going to end smoking in restaurants, and then you've got that great quote for a second paragraph. A delayed lead is used in a feature story, in which usually by the 4th paragraph, then you come up with what the story is really about. So the lead there may be sort of a anecdotal lead that tells a little story, and then you get in what the story is really all about. Well, normally, if you're writing for a newspaper, you're writing for an audience that would have about a 10th grade education, or you want it to be something that people can understand and that it's clear. One of the best sources for me in finding the right word is the dictionary, and look up the specific meanings. And I still use the dictionary and depend on it and find out that a word isn't as precise as I thought it was, but it refers me to another word. And I think when we say the right word, we're really talking about the precise word, the word that really means exactly what you're trying to say. I think when you're writing a book, for example, where you still have deadlines, but they're much longer. And there you also have more time. And it's really important in any writing to write and to rewrite and to go back and look at it again. And so if you have enough time, perhaps rewrite a third time, a second time. Usually on a newspaper, you don't have that luxury. And that's where you really need a really good editor. Well, there are only two kinds of editors, good ones and bad ones. Good ones are totally invaluable, and bad ones you just have to live with. I've been both an editor and a writer for newspapers. And an editor on a newspaper is frequently what is called a copy editor. A copy editor then refines what a reporter has done, and they give it a second look. And since most news articles are written on deadlines, that second look is important, and it helps you. And if an editor sees something that isn't clear, then they really need to ask the reporter. You occasionally find some editors who think they know what the reporter meant and then get it wrong. The first book I wrote was The Orangeburg Massacre with Jack Nelson, and we both covered the trial of the 9 highway patrolmen who were acquitted. Well, I was never really interested in writing a book until, as a reporter, I covered what became known as the Orangeburg Massacre, the shooting of more than 30 students at South Carolina State College, 3 of whom were killed and at least 27 were injured. And it's really more than that. Several others not on the official list have since been discovered. And I covered that and what the events that followed that were related to it, including 2 trials, and realized it was too big a story to tell in a newspaper format. So that became my first book, and that's how I got into it. And after that, it was a little bit of one thing leads to another. Thurman books, with Senator Thurman, I'd just been long interested in thinking a biography needed to be written. And so I went back late in life and got my PhD at Emory and needed a good dissertation subject, and my agent said he thought this one could get a book contract. So I wrote the book Ostrom, the first one, and with Marilyn Thompson, and it was all strictly according to format for getting a doctorate. And then after Senator Thurman's death and his daughter, Essie Mae Washington Williams, came forward, we got an inquiry from a publisher wanting us to do a different biography of Strom Thurman, which we did. What I've found in writing about real people, and I've done 2 biographies of people who are alive when I first wrote them, is to talk to as many different sources as you can of people who know them, people who like them, people who don't like them, people whose lives have been enriched by them, people who have felt disappointment in their lives perhaps because of something that person has done. What you're after is a well-rounded story. A biography is a life. You're telling a life. And so the more you know and can corroborate, and ideally you can develop a good relationship with the person you may not particularly disagree with, but who interests you and who you think's lived an important life. And and I did my biography of Strom Thurman. He said he wasn't granting interviews at that time. And I can tell this story now. So I called him on the phone and spoke to his assistant who knew me and said, I said, I need to speak to the senator. And she said, I'll put him on. So I said, Senator, I'd like to just spend a day with you in Washington. It's going around. He said, well, I'm not giving interviews. I'm getting too many requests, not giving any interviews. But I had interviewed him a number of times in the past. And this was when he was in his late 90s, and I didn't feel I needed to interview him. But one person I did want to interview was Thomas Moss, who had been on his staff. He was the first African-American hired by any member of Congress from this state. And I knew Mr. Moss before Senator Thurman knew him. And he said, well, no, I just don't let my staff get interviews. And I said, well, Senator, he's not going to say anything bad about you. He said, I don't know, I just can't do it. So I felt a little frustrated for a day or so, and then I called Tom Moss and told him what the senator said and said, He said, Duke Short, he said, his son's assistant, he says, you're doing an unauthorized interview. And Mr. Morse laughed, said, he figured if Jack Bass was writing it, he didn't care whether it was authorized or unauthorized. So anyway, I got him to come to my son's house in Columbia one day, and he gave me a marvelous 2-hour interview that revealed a great deal of information that from my perspective would be positive about the senator, but that was insightful. Had never been written and never would be written. And so that was an extremely valuable interview of how Senator Thurman interacted with the black community in South Carolina in the last really 3 decades of his life. To a certain extent, there's an intuitive feel about a source. Sometimes if it's a source that's a human source and you're interviewing someone and they tell you something that might be a little embarrassing about themselves or something they did that is not altogether laudable, you can pretty much depend and have an intuitive feel that what this person is going to tell you is telling you the whole truth. I can think of a couple people. Judge Frank Johnson was one, and Ruth Johnson, his wife, was even more so, and Judge Skelly Wright from different books, were people that just seem to be congenitally unable to tell you other than the actual truth and facts, and you could rely on that. Other than that, you can get corroborative sources. You should have already done a lot of research before you go into an oral history interview. If I'm doing a book about a contemporary period, I like to do a lot of oral history. And the interviewing techniques one learns as a journalist is really quite helpful there. And oral history simply means interviewing people who are still alive. And you have to do research ahead of time to understand much of the story in order to ask the right questions and to get the right answers. What oral history allows you to do is get information that only exists in the head of a person who has been involved in the story. And what I have found is people who have played historic roles in their life, perhaps they've been a governor or a judge or some other role, is they know a lot, and many of them are eager to sort of tell those stories. And then you get these wonderful, what are called the telling anecdote, that's interesting to read and gives real depth and meaning to the situation you're trying to explain, and is helpful to the reader both in understanding what's going on and getting a better idea of the human element that's involved. Sometimes you feel a source is holding back a little bit. And my experience, and it was intuitive, I don't know how I started doing it, but someone noticed it and pointed it out to me that it was effective, was listening to someone. They'd tell you something and you'd feel that they're not telling you everything or something's not quite right, and I would just sort of sit and silently and look at them. And usually, for whatever reason, they would come back and, well, there's a little bit more to the story or whatever. If a source believes that you're competent and capable and accurate and don't have an axe to grind and just want to get the facts and develop understanding of the issue or the person you're writing about, they're usually very forthcoming. Another whole element, particularly if you're dealing with oral history or interview of a live person, is just having done research and being informed about the subject yourself. Because the more you know and the more they know that you know, the more likely you are to get the answers that are complete to the question you're asking. If you're telling a biography and you're writing about a life, then you have to tell the whole life. You have to be fair and you have to be accurate. And sometimes the family may not like certain things that are in the biography. And you just have to live with that, because you're really not writing for the family unless it's an authorized biography, and I don't write authorized biographies. But you're really writing for the reader. And you want the reader to understand this person, and none of us are perfect. And so if you get the whole person, you have to write what you know to be factual and that is balanced. In addition to the interviewing about the person, you're doing a lot of reading. So when I did the biography of Judge Frank Johnson especially, You know, I read numerous court opinions he wrote, but he also made a lot of speeches that were meaningful speeches. He had a powerful intellect. And the same with Strom Thurmond. You look at documents. If you have a family member that doesn't want to participate, you can attempt to persuade them that, you know things that no one else knows. And it gives insight into the character of the person in the family you're writing about. But if they decide they just don't want to do it, then you just have to accept they're not going to do it. If you're writing nonfiction, everything has to be factual and true. And if you're writing nonfiction on a long book, you're going to make some errors. And you want to keep them to the very, very minimum. And if you're not certain, just don't include it. My background as a reporter is very helpful to me in just my staying in the background. And I think writers should stay in the background. That does not mean you don't need analysis. And you don't need some conclusions that are drawn. But one of the best compliments I've received is someone who read my biography of Strom Thurmond and said, what I really liked about it is you let me make the decision of whether I liked him or didn't like him. And the same with the biography of Judge Frank Johnson. I wanted this story of this life and then let the reader draw their own conclusions. In putting a person in a particular situation, be observant. Look for details, and particularly telling details. Here's some of the things that bring out the character of a person. What do they surround themselves with? How do they dress? You know, if somebody mowing the lawn and they're wearing a coat and tie, that tells you something about them. If somebody is a judge and he likes just to wear loud sports shirts while he's sitting in his office, that tells you something about him. If someone has a cluttered desk like mine, that tells you something about them. I'm not sure what it tells you, but it tells you something. If you have someone who has drawings from their grandchildren when they're pre-kindergarten and they have them framed on the wall, that tells you something about them. So look at the surroundings of the situation in which they're in. Describe a little bit how they dress. Might even be what they eat. These little details all bring out something. Use direct quotes. Hear their language. Hear their voices. That tells you a little bit of something about their character. And then each person has their own writing style. So what works for one writer won't necessarily work for another. Don't necessarily try and copy anybody else. Let your own style develop. And if you read chapter 5 of Elements of Style, it really tells you how that happens. And really be a master of good punctuation, what specific words mean. And so much is involved in getting it factual, and so much about getting it factual is choosing the right word. So much of what goes into a television production, in particular documentary, is not so much in the writing as selecting what you have from other sources. But the interviewing techniques that one learns as a journalist, whether it's a print journalist or a TV journalist, then become very important. The good questions really focus on issues of conflict. I teach my students something we call the GAUSS technique. It's just a memory device. And G stands for goals, O for obstacles, S for start, and S for solutions. And those types of questions. And usually a start question, if you're interviewing a person who's being profiled, for example, might be just, tell me when and where you were born. It's a non-threatening question. And a good interview is a good conversation. And save the tough questions for last. In terms of writing nonfiction, be aware you have to be factual, you have to be accurate, you need a good command of English grammar, you need to understand that two of your most reliable sources are going to be a good dictionary and a thesaurus, and that you want to tell things in a way that people will understand it. And telling stories is just telling stories. And let your writing just be the way you write. And another thing is to have a good teacher who understands how to write and who can guide you and let you develop your own style, because different people write differently. Doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just that a good writer reflects the person who is writing as well as the subject that is being written about.